heard about us before. So it's still a somewhat new institute. So we were founded about 10 years ago, based in Doha, Qatar, and we are part of Qatar Foundation. Maybe that's all I'll say. But happy to, if there are questions related to our institute, happy to answer those later or by email or in whatever form and shape. Yeah, today I'll mostly talk about a data source that you might not be aware of and how it can be used for social good. So I really don't mind being interrupted or so. So I think the whole session will end in just over 50 minutes. So probably, but otherwise it'll be like 35 minutes or something presentation followed by questions. But as I said, I also don't mind mixing questions in between. So feel free to interrupt at any point. What I'll present is
I might just jump in and say one thing I've seen that works quite well is the chat. So if people want to type questions in on the chat, and if Ingmar's got that, that might be a way of just kind of politely interrupting without doing what I'm just doing, which is to, or if that messes you up, Ingmar, I don't know.
Okay, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well, but otherwise, literally, I also don't mind. Okay, I'll do my best. Usually, I'm not very good at monitoring the chat because I'm also showing things live on the screen and stuff. But let's see. So if I don't seem to be responding to your chat interruption, then just shout out. I honestly don't mind. Great. So yeah, and actually you can see, because I'm sharing my whole screen, not just because I'll be swapping, so you can actually see me if I'm chatting, looking at the chat or not, so to speak. Yeah, so the work that I'll be presenting is a joint work with different people at QCRI. So in particular, Ferda Jisun, Joao, Masumali, and Reham, but then also a bunch of people outside of QCRI, in particular at UN agencies and different NGOs. Before going through my slide deck, actually, I want to show a couple of things live. And I think this will be the most interesting part or the most instructive part, hopefully. So what I'm showing here is everything I'm showing is publicly accessible as long as you have an account on the corresponding platform. So I'll start with Facebook, but then I'll also probably show LinkedIn and maybe Twitter, Snapchat, and Google. Let's see. So this is on Facebook's advertising platform. So here, I'm about to launch an advertising campaign targeting people matching certain criteria, right? I mean, Facebook makes money through targeted advertising. And so the targeting criteria start with a location, and even more specifically, I can target people who are either living in a location, or of course now, during times of COVID, it might also be interesting at looking at people who are traveling in a location. But usually we look at people living in a location, because a lot of our work looks at sort of like official statistics and how to improve those. And typically in official statistics, people are looking at people living in a particular location. So here, so far, I've selected the location of the city of Melbourne, but I can be sub-city in a second, but let's just start sort of more broadly. Ages 13 and above, all genders. And now the crucial thing is that before I launch my advertising campaign and before I have to pay anything, Facebook provides an estimate about how many of its users match my targeting criteria. So here says 3.3 million users, and these are an estimates for the monthly active users. You can also get estimates for daily active users, but usually we use these monthly active user estimates in our work. So basically, Facebook and this you can also get programmatically. Usually, I would show the network traffic and the actual API call underneath, but because this is being recorded and there's like an account number in the API call, I'm not going to show this now. But if you're interested in the sort of automation of this, please get in touch and I'll share details later. So think of this as a sort of real-time digital census over, in this case, Facebook users. So what is this useful for? So for example, you could look at, okay, what about gender distribution sort of among Facebook users sort of, right? And so out of 3.3 million, there are about 1.6 million men and 1.7 million women. So this is actually a good sign because we find that globally the gender distribution on Facebook is a strong indicator for the gender distribution on the internet. So the fact that there's a balanced gender balance in terms of Facebook users speaks actually well of Australia in terms of gender balance, in terms of internet usage more broadly. And we have a whole research line just looking at digital gender gaps or so. Now, this is sort of one. So you get insights into gender gaps. Now, another thing you could look at is you could look at socioeconomic status through different ways. So first, let's look at income. So it's not that. So one proxy for income is the type of devices people use to access Facebook. And the simplest proxy, which again works really well in a lot of different contexts, and we've looked at this in many, many countries, is just the operating system. So put simply, Apple iOS devices are more expensive than Android devices and other type of devices. So just knowing the percentage of users who are using iOS devices is often a good proxy for areas with higher and lower income. And I'll show some data visualizations around this this later. So the absolute number is not so much what we are interested here after, but more the relative percentage of this, and of the total of Facebook users, what's the percentage using iOS devices in a particular area compared to other areas? This is sort of what we're interested in. Other things you can look at is you can look at how many of these people have certain self-declared university degrees, sort of education levels, sorry. And of course, this is now self-declared, right? Whereas the iOS device is, metadata, so that's probably quite trustworthy. Now, of course, we have to worry more about data quality, right? So you can look at, okay, how many of those female iOS users living in Melbourne are college graduates, let's say, right? Right? And it goes down further, right? Then maybe, and again, this here I'm adding is right. Must also. So it's like a filter, right? Of these, maybe I'm interested only in certain network connectivity issues, and so I'm interested in how many of these use 4G to connect to predominantly to connect to Facebook, right? And this might be interesting, in particular in the developing context. If you wanted to map, coverage or sort of get an insight to how people connect to Facebook, et cetera, So there are lots and lots of different sort of ways to connect. Oh yeah, one more actually. This is because this is one that we'll also use in our work quite a bit. Is you can look at countries somebody has lived in before. So there is a general category that just lives abroad. So of these women, now again, remember we're just looking at women in Melbourne using iOS devices who also self-declared university graduates, who are also predominantly using 4G to access Facebook, and who must also be living abroad. So this is now, and now it gets into the sort of the black box issue, right? Like, what does it mean to be living abroad? Like, how do they know somebody's home country? And again, these are important issues. We'll talk a bit more about sort of later, but for now, let's just sort of take it as face value, sort of. So now we have, we can sort of get insights into this. But you can also, rather than looking at just living abroad in general, you can look at particular countries of origin. I don't know, I'm not so familiar with the. Oh, okay, that was a good guess. Okay, this is still not sparse. So now we are looking at women who used to live in the Philippines and who are predominantly using 4G and who are self-declared college graduates and who use iOS devices living in Melbourne, sort of, right? And again, at every step of the way, we get a real-time estimate about the number of Facebook users matching these criteria, right? And so in a nutshell, so we're using this type of data, and maybe I'll quickly show to other platforms, right, for gender gaps. This is the gender dimension. To look at socioeconomic situation, this is mostly the device type, but also education level and access type, and sort of migration background, or sort of. So those are sort of three key variables that we use through this. There's a lot of other things that we don't really use in our research that much, which is what Facebook usually makes its money off, which is the interest-based targeting. So those are a bit sort of noisier, and at least for the type of work that we are using, are a bit harder to use, but we have explored those, but I won't really talk much about those, right? You can look at people interested in, let me just remove the Philippines condition, and let's say, interested in Australia, let's see, probably there's an interest related to this, right? So there's an interest in, so how many people living in Melbourne are interested in Australia, whatever that means, or sort of, right? So here people who have expressed on interest in or like pages related to Australia, right? But people have looked at things such as, different cuisines, like, how many people living in Melbourne are interested in German cuisine. I mean, now it's, women with a college degree, et cetera, sort of, so you can do some fun things there. I hope this is clear, just sort of, and again, this is, you don't have to do screen scraping. This is accessible through the official Facebook Graph API, with the certain rate limits, et cetera, sort of, so you can automate this quite well. So I'll show a few data visualizations around this, and then maybe I'll show a few other data sources. So here, just to illustrate what
there were a couple of quick questions.
Please, yes, please. Thanks. Yes.
Alistair wants to know whether you can find me. So more specifically,
Yes.
can you find us? Can you get that number down to an individual?
Yes. Very good.
And the other question was about whether you've noticed the 4G thing has dropped due to COVID.
Yes. Okay. So I'll start with the first question. So the short answer is not anymore. So let me tell you about the history and also all the mishaps that happened with this sort of platform. So when Facebook first launched this advertising platform, I don't remember, was it 10 years ago? Sorry if I get the timeline wrong. Let's say 10 years ago, like roughly sort of or so. They didn't do anything of what you see here now, right? So now there's like a lower sort of number. At that point, there was no rounding, nothing. You could absolutely trivially identify a user using a few characteristics and then see, is that user interested in online dating? Is that user interested in religious content, right? Is that user interested in meeting men or something, right? Like even there's like dating related information in here sort of also, right? So at that point, absolutely trivially. As of now, so that was iteration number one, obviously clear privacy evaluation, and researchers pointed that kindly out to Facebook, and then Facebook said, oh yeah, you're probably right, we should probably not go down to individuals. And then they introduced some sort of rounding, but at that point they still allowed a combination with so-called custom audiences. So this is the creepiest part of all of this. So this is up here, which is not what we're using So custom audiences are typically used, let's say, if you are a store who has like a loyalty program, right? And you'd like to reach your users, just your users on Facebook, and say, hey, oh, you recently came shopping at us. Here we're running a special campaign just for loyal customers, something like this, right? And this is a perfectly legitimate user sort of, right? And you can opt out of having your email shared, etc. Now, what researchers showed, what you could do is you could combine this custom audiences with this thing, right? You could say, okay, let's say upload emails of all of my friends, and then let's say of my friends, how many are men interested in men? Okay, just how many, not who, right? But just how many sort of. So, and then we'll get an estimate of how many users match that criteria, right? Sort of. So that itself might already be a bit, problematic, right? You could imagine, just picking some group, whatever you're interested in, just saying, hi, see, there's actually not zero some count, right? But then more programmatically, the rounding that is done here, and there is some rounding. Let me just remove this sort of here. Seems to be done deterministically, in the sense that once you sort of experimentally find the middle, you can sort of add or remove one user, and it'll sort of jump up and down, sort of. Right? And so with enough queries, sort of, so it was not trivial, right? I mean, you had to be quite clever. You could actually find out if an individual was in the set or not. Moreover, these custom audiences were so broad that you could just upload all mobile phone numbers in the US ending in a 0, and all mobile phone numbers where the third digit is a 5, etc. And then through clever intersection, and if is it in this and this, you could basically find out the phone number of any Facebook user whatsoever, as long as you knew enough sort of targeting criteria, right? Sort of. Right. And again, this was not trivial. You really had to be very clever about it, sort of. But this was technically possible. And again, this was done by I know Krishna Gumadi in particular, but there was a lot of others involved in that study, right? And again, those were privacy researchers that were kind enough to, tell Facebook, hey, that's probably not what you want, sort of, so that people can just look up, phone numbers of Facebook users. And then Facebook said, oh yeah, there's probably an issue. And so now you can no longer combine these custom audiences with these audience estimates. So I can still target my friends, if I upload their email addresses that are, on Facebook, who are also college graduates or something, but Facebook would no longer provide audience estimates. Furthermore, the smallest audience size for that to work would have to be 1,000 people. So it's sort of has become much more true. So as of now, to be honest, I don't see a way to get information about individual users through this particular platform, but in the past that was certainly possible. There's still the related issue of group harm. Maybe we can talk about that later, which is sometimes overlooked in this sort of privacy debate, right? I can still identify potentially vulnerable people, right? Especially in the migration context. I could look at, people who used to live in Mexico who now live in a particular part of the US, and there sometimes we find that Facebook's estimates are actually bigger than official statistics, right? And then you're thinking, is it Facebook that's wrong, or is it official statistics that's wrong? And what does it sort of say about sort of, potentially, vulnerable groups, and, who has a register of those, sort of. So, but that's not the individual level, that's sort of the group level risk of this. For the second platform, so a question related to 4G and changes to COVID. What we so we have sorry for jumping around a bit, but these are good questions. So we have a platform. This is joint work with the University of Oxford and sponsored by an NGO called Data2X that looks at data gender gaps, where we look at global differences in internet access, and we're using this Facebook data as a proxy. And for this project, we have pretty much daily data, with some reporting lag, so. And in this daily data, we've certainly seen changes, in particular concerning the daily active users, meaning that in most countries, the Facebook usage has gone up since the corona epidemic, and not in all countries in a sort of gender equal manner. To be honest, I have not looked at, and I don't even know if we have data for that's disaggregated by 4G or other sources. So there's no historic data you can get through this platform. So if you don't collect this data today, tomorrow you will no longer have this data. So I don't think we can answer the question related to 4G in particular. I can double check, but I don't think we have that disaggregation in our data. Other questions, and please interrupt. It's just mostly about the data source. I like to talk about applications, but really understanding the data is the key of the presentation. Okay, then for now I'll just continue with sort of a couple of data visualizations around this. So here I'm showing data visualizations for New York City. This is not live data. This is data that was collected in 2017. And at that point, also the smallest targetable unit was still 20 users. Now it is 1,000 users, sort of. So that shows higher resolution was still possible at that point. But just to show the kind of things you can do first in a context where it's more of a toy example, and then later in something that's actually a bit more interesting. So suppose you didn't know anything at all about the wealth distribution in New York City. And as a first order proxy, you can just look at the percentage of Facebook users using iOS devices in different parts of the city, right? And so here you'll see that, again, I mean, I assume most of you have some familiarity with New York City, right? So this is like, Manhattan, Midtown, etc. Where this area here, where you have about 90% of Facebook users using iOS, is also exactly, exactly the area with the lowest poverty rate in all of New York City. And this area here, where there's much lower iOS users, again, is exactly the area with the highest poverty rate in all of New York City, sort of. Right? Other things that you can sort of look at is sort of the countries of origin. I mean, here we say citizenship, but this is not true. This is not what Facebook says. It's just Facebook says the country somebody has lived in. So people who used to live in Latin American countries, where do they live now? So their density as a sort of, or the fraction of the total, is highest in the Bronx and sort of neighboring areas, right? So here you would have about 40% of Facebook users living in this area who used to live in countries from Latin America, right? Sort of, so et cetera, et cetera. Now, in the case of New York City, this is just a toy example. You have open government data. I'm not telling you anything that you couldn't find through, census data or sort of. So this is just sort of, basic validation, let's say. Doha doesn't have open government data, so this is already a bit more interesting. And again, this is data from 2017. It's not live in any way. So if you wanted to understand which part of town Nepalis or people who used to live in Nepal, which in the Qatari context really is people with a Nepali citizenship, live in, sort of. So right. So then this would be one of the few data sources. Again, anecdotally, I can definitely tell you that this is true, that they do live in the industrial area. And if you just Google industrial area Doha, you'd see that this area was built to house people from Southeast Asia and the Indian sort of subcontinent. Yeah, anyway, so this is sort of one set of factors. You also see that people from Nepal are almost all men. Again, these are migrant workers, construction workers. Surprisingly high number of self-declared university graduates. Again, this is a bit surprising. I don't know if this is true or if it's a different definition of what a college means or sort of. So this I'm not quite sure about. the age range fairly young, and then almost all Android device users, sort of. So 90, upwards of 90%. Sort of. So if you compare this with other, countries of origin, such as myself from Western Europe, I mean, I live in this part of town, again, not coincidentally. This is, high-rise city center, sort of, so far more expensive also to live. Roughly gender balanced. I can bring over my wife and family. Unfortunately, people from Nepal don't have the minimum income to pass a threshold to get a family visa. More university graduates, older people. I'm not yet in this age bucket, but I'm approaching it, right? These are the knowledge expats. And then you have more iOS users than Android users, right? Sort of so. And again, conceptually, you can do this anywhere in the world. So I just show one other area. So in New York City, you have zip codes you can target. This is why you have these nice shape files. In Doha, we don't use zip codes, and the other biggest targetable areas would be very, very big. So you can sort of construct your own area by just latitude, longitude, and a sort of radius. In Lagos, Nigeria, we're using, for this demo, neighborhoods that Facebook supports, but they don't give us the shape files. So here we're just using a circle, but these are actually, there's a neighborhood called Ilasamaja, but I don't know the exact boundary box, right? And again, if I wanted to understand wealth distribution in Lagos, I could look at iOS as a first proxy. And this area here, Lagos Island, is where the government is based, sort of. So this is kind of the equivalent of Manhattan in a sense, sort of. So, right? And you sort of see that here you have about 15% iOS users, whereas in other parts you have like 7%, right? Of course, you don't have the 90% of Manhattan, right? This is still Nigeria. It's not, the US, but the relative difference still is interesting. And then maybe just very briefly, just very briefly, just a few of the other data sources, because the concept of these platforms applies to anything at all that has advertising. So it could be WeChat, it can be Contactia, it can be anything at all, any platform whatsoever, that is so far that I've come across that has advertising, has a platform like this. So I'll just show like a few more. Again, I don't want to spend the whole hour just running through every single platform on the web that has advertising, but here's LinkedIn, people living in Australia. There are 11 million in total. And let's see, narrow down further. Let's see what might be fun. Maybe job experience, this member skills, and again here, let's say artificial intelligence. And of course, here again, like the question of data quality. What does it mean to have a skill of artificial intelligence on LinkedIn, right? That's obviously like a key point, and hopefully we can talk about that more later. But now you can sort of see disaggregate, and I could narrow down further. I can even look at people who now work at RMIT or who studied at RMIT and now are somewhere else, sort of. So, and for LinkedIn, I think the smallest targetable unit is 200, so slightly smaller than 1,000 on Facebook. Similarly for whatever Twitter, Snapchat, Google, and sort of other platforms. So here I'm showing Melbourne on Twitter, and Twitter gives a range. It's a bit different, but it's still very, very similar, sort of. Okay, maybe I'll stop there. And if at the end you want to see a particular platform, let me know, and I'll see if I can show this. But hopefully the idea is clear. So some of the things that we're using this data for. So I've already mentioned the angle of migration. I've mentioned the angle of sort of wealth/poverty mapping. I've mentioned the angle of gender disaggregation. And this is basically sort of a combination of migration and poverty, sort of. So we look at vulnerability assessment of refugees. And then if there's time at the end, I'll talk about something that we do related to COVID that's similar also in this space. Okay, so the first example study, sort of, and again, feel free to interrupt at any point, sort of. But the first example study.
There was just one very quick question. Somebody just said, is that Facebook interface only available on desktop? They couldn't see it on their phone.
That I don't know. So certainly there's an API. I mean, ultimately, if you wanted to collect the data, you would go through the API, but it should be available on any platform. But you do need to create, I think, like a if I remember, you have to create like a dummy page you want to promote or something, sort of. So it will not. There are like a couple of steps required until you get to the step of audience selection. But I think the page itself should be available on any on any platform.
Thank you.
But again, like if you wanted to collect data, again, you of course you don't go through the screen. You go through an API, and I'd be happy to send more details about this. So the first study looks at Venezuela. This was a joint work with people from UNHCR, UNICEF, and also an NGO called IMAP. In this case, they are a Colombia office, and it looked at the Venezuelan crisis. So just one slide about the Venezuelan situation. So actually, I should check this. These numbers might be a bit old, sort of, so maybe a few months ago. I don't know if they still apply, but at that point, the annual inflation rate in Venezuela was upwards of 10,000%. So this is not 10 comma something percent. This is really 10,000%. Unemployment was upwards of 35%. At that point, the minimum wage. So if you spend every single dollar of your minimum wage on food, you could only buy about 1,000 calories a day, right? Which I'm sure most of you know, this is not enough to survive. So there was, or there still is, this thing called Maduro diet, right, where people lose weight because they're basically starving because they can't buy enough food. And as a consequence of this crisis, upwards of 4 million people have left Venezuela, mostly into Colombia and other countries in the area. Now, when it comes to sort of supporting these migrants and refugees, there's actually, in all these crises, there's always a challenge concerning like that the data is quite bad, sort of, right? Because often it's based on self-registration, and often for whatever reason, these migrants and refugees might be hesitant to, self-register in, sort of surveys, etc., that are being performed. And so the question is, are there alternative data sources that might be available? And so here we explored the use of this Facebook data, right? So here basically, we looked at how many people now live in Colombia according to Facebook, but used to live in Venezuela, right? And more specifically in parts of Colombia, and more specifically have a particular gender, and more specifically have a particular device type that they use to access Facebook, et cetera, sort of. So all the things that you saw before. But again, the key variable here is lived in Venezuela, sort of. So this is what we sort of look at here. So here I'm just showing some plots where this is now aggregated at the country level. So if we just look at the red first, so this is the country that's sort of hardest. Well, maybe hardest hit is too negative a word, but that's sort of accommodating the most migrants and refugees from Venezuela. So here, this line. So on the x-axis you have time. So we've been collecting this data over time. So we have a single collection that dates back to 2016, and then sort of systematically we started collecting this data in mid 2018. And then the bottom line is just the raw estimate that Facebook tells us. It's just the number of Facebook users aged, I believe it was 18 and above, living in Colombia, but who used to live in Venezuela, right? And you can sort of see how this increases. And note that this is a logarithmic scale to accommodate the smaller countries as well. And it goes up from, I think, about the million or so here to like 1.5 million or so here. And since then, it hasn't really improved much, sort of. So this is more or less also the peak of the exodus. This is the lower bar. And then now the upper bar is where we try to correct for the fact that, of course, not everybody is on Facebook. So if for now we assume there's not a single false positive, so if we assume that every person who lived in Venezuela is truly a Venezuelan refugee or migrant, then if we knew the Facebook penetration rate among those, we could sort of actually get a true estimate. And this is what we try here, where we assume that the Facebook penetration among Venezuelan migrants and refugees in Colombia is the same as among Colombians in general living in Colombia. And that second number we can estimate. We can just get some estimate about the current population in Colombia, and we can get some estimate of the total number of monthly active users in Colombia. So that's easy to compute. And then we sort of, apply this sort of correction to sort of, scale this up to this. So this is it is what it is. And the other colors are different countries, and in gray you have the whole of Latin America. Now these other points are estimates that come from different UN sort of surveys or ways to estimate these numbers or sort of. And you so there are sort of two different efforts to estimate this, and you'd see that this actually falls within this, let's say, band of plausibility, or sort of also whatever you want to sort of call it. It's fairly close. So both in the case of most individual countries, so would be Colombia, Peru, etc., but also for the whole region. Still, if you use the upper bar of Facebook, then there might be even more than what the United Nations would estimate. So one challenge when doing this work is exactly the fact that the ground truth is missing or bad, sort of. Right? So when you try to validate, is this actually finding something? Right? If we already knew the answer, well, we wouldn't be interested in doing this exercise in the first place, because there wouldn't be any reason to do it. But it's exactly because we don't know the true answer. Sometimes we're not sure if if some of these mistakes, so to speak, is sort of our methodology, or is it sort of the sort of ground truth data. This is even more pronounced here. So now this is at the subnational level, where for Colombia there were efforts based on self-registration to have a subnational distribution of migrants and refugees from Venezuela. So these are efforts from the Colombian government in June 2018, based on, again, self-registration. And if you compare this with our estimates from around the same time from Facebook, you would see, some spatial similarity, but also definitely differences, sort of, right? Like sort of, so in particular, Facebook, according to Facebook, there are more people matching those criteria inland rather than just on the border. And because we worked with people in Colombia, they actually told us that this on the right is far more plausible than this on the left, because the self-registration efforts were far more pronounced on the actual border rather than more inland. So even people in the humanitarian sector, they sort of say, this is probably closer to the truth than this. But again, this makes it hard to validate this, right? Or sort of scientifically now, sort of, because we are kind of claiming the ground truth is wrong, but we can't prove it because, again, there is no other ground truth, right? This is as close to the ground truth as anything. But then people on the ground say, but this doesn't look plausible. We trust this more, sort of. So these are some of the sort of challenges. We could do this for other countries, but for other countries, we don't even have ground truth, right? So here we compute this. And this actually led, maybe I should say this actually led to changes in the operation. So UNICEF was running a anti-xenophobia campaign in Brazil. And initially they were only targeting the north, but because based on our analysis, there's at least also some non-negligible presence further south, they actually adjusted their sort of targeting of this campaign, based on these findings. So hopefully this led to better outcomes, and then, so apart from just the numbers, again, you can also look at the device types. Based on the device types, you can come up with a sort of regression model that tries to predict the income, not of an individual, but of a group, right? If you have, here are like 100,000 Facebook users, and of those, 2,000 to have an iOS device, then, as a group, we would expect an average income of such and such, okay? And how is this trained? So this model is trained using the sort of 20 or so, or maybe 15 host countries that you see here with their GDP. So we know the GDP of the US, or the GDP per capita of the US. We know the GDP per capita of Spain. We know the GDP per capita of Brazil, etc. And for all of these countries, we also know the percentage of Facebook users using iOS devices, right? And so now we use this to train a model. That model works pretty well. This is just a single model, a single variable. Again, the only variable is the percentage of iOS devices, and it gets an R squared of 0.8 something. I forgot the second digit. So it works, quite well, even though it has a single variable. And this model is now applied to these subpopulations. So now we look just at the people from Venezuela living in Colombia, the people who used to live in Venezuela now living in Peru, right? And now you sort of have different groups that emerge, and these groups are sort of robust against a number of modifications that we've sort of tried, sort of. So basically, people who used to live in Venezuela and now live in particular in Roraima, Brazil, which is the jungle, on the border with Venezuela that you can walk to. We would estimate that they are most vulnerable, at least in terms of sort of finances, sort of. So because at least based on the devices, they are least likely to have access to anything, resembling an expensive device, right? Whereas people who who used to live in Venezuela, who now live in the United States, they're probably of least concern. I mean, they have pretty good access to high-end devices, and then there's sort of also these other sort of countries in between. And again, this can be done in real time. You can look at changes over time, et cetera, sort of. So this is quite useful. Yeah, and there's some references, and I'll share the slide with Bala later if you want to read more about the references. Elaborating on this, how am I doing for time? Okay, maybe I'll just talk more about the poverty, and then maybe I'll already wrap up. So more about the poverty angle in a bit more depth. And this is joint work with again people at UNICEF, also a small data science startup based in the Philippines, Thinking Machines, and people at the World Bank. And so, yeah, so just one slide of background on why mapping poverty is an exercise worth doing. Probably most, if not all of you, have heard about the Sustainable Development Goals, right? The SDGs, so there are 17 of those, which are these big lofty goals that all the United Nations members countries of the world actually agreed on, right? That's like something that's quite rare, that by 2030, the world should strive to achieve these 17 goals. The first of these 17 goals is no poverty, okay? Now, there are different definitions of poverty, and also different organizations sort of prefer different definitions. Some have a more, like say, a multidimensional definition of poverty, or more broadly deprivation, that also includes education and health and other things. But the standard definition, which is also the one that the World Bank typically uses, only looks at finances, right? It just basically looks at like how much money do you make, right? That's it. And again, we can sort of discuss whether that's the best definition of poverty, but this is the standard one, right? So for this one, the definition is $1.25 per day, right? So this is what we considered extreme poverty. There are the different levels. Now, when it comes to measuring progress on this, the available data is quite outdated. So often available data comes from censuses, and censuses are typically done every 10 years. So right now, many countries around the world would typically be doing their census, right? It's also, of course, a challenge now due to sort of COVID that, going from door to door is a bit trickier. But anyways, so this means that many countries in the world will now not have, will have data that's outdated by 10 years. And here I'm just listing a few of those. Even when data is not quite as outdated, is often not very spatially granular, at the sort of sub-city level. Typically, it would be aggregated into certain administrative units, right? And this, again, makes it hard if you were to plan any poverty intervention, right? Like, I'm sure not all of Melbourne, has the same socioeconomic situation. And if you just have like a single variable for all of Melbourne, this is not very actionable, sort of, right? And so we sort of try to have look at ways to have something more spatially fine-grained. So how do we do this again? So I already, you already know the Facebook data, in particular, the device type that is highly predictive. But then also there's now already quite a body of work that looks at satellite imagery. So it started with night light satellite imagery, where people observed that areas with a lot of light at night were also areas with higher economic activity, which typically, maps to higher wealth. But then more recently, people have also started using daytime satellite imagery. So here I'm just showing two areas from Doha to sort of motivate this, right? And these are only like a few kilometers apart, right? If you were to estimate the likely income of somebody living in this type of accommodation, right, which is a very plain roof where like trucks parked outside, or versus somebody, in the area on the right, where you have like a park and a pool, right, you'd of course rightly assume that probably here's a higher wealth than the area on the left, right? But now, of course, how do you teach a machine this, right? We don't want to encode manually, look at the shade of green and count the pixels that are blue, no, right? This is now where deep learning comes in, that sort of does a feature extraction automatically. But here the challenge is we don't have a lot of annotation, right? Like if we had pixel level annotation or something, this would be feasible, to learn a model from scratch. We don't have this, so the next big thing is to rely on sort of fine tuning. So there's basically a network that's pre-trained on a general object recognition task, and that's then fine-tuned on the task of predicting night light intensity, and that is then used to extract visual features. Again, if that's confusing, I'm happy to discuss that also later. But basically, this is not our idea. This is what others have done before. But we're just interested in comparing, comparing and combining different data sources, the Facebook data with satellite imagery. So for the study, so it's ultimately a standard regression task. You want to predict some kind of wealth value at a different location. So here, the ground truth we are using for this comes from USAID, who's running a survey called the Demographic and Health Survey. So they run this every couple of years in quite a large number of low and middle income countries. Now, for this survey, they don't ask how much money do you make in terms of income, but they ask how much stuff do you have, right? They ask, do you have a fridge? Do you have a television? Do you have a mobile phone? Do you have running water, etc., right? And this is then all compiled into a single wealth index using principal component analysis. And this wealth index is then what's sort of used as a it's a definition of wealth, right? So areas where people have a lot of stuff have a higher wealth, and areas where people have less stuff have a sort of lower wealth, or in this case even a negative wealth index. And so this is now becomes the target indicator, right? So they only survey some locations. So can we kind of enrich their survey by extrapolating out from the surveyed locations to other locations, sort of, right? So that would be sort of the goal. And we want to do this combining different features, both from Facebook, such as the percentage of users using iOS, but also just the Facebook penetration itself. Just the Facebook penetration itself is also a strong predictor of wealth. Areas with high Facebook penetration are also generally wealthier. And again, combine this with the visual features from the satellite imagery. And then it's just a standard regression task. You have the features, you have the ground truth, right? And you try to predict the wealth index, so you can try your favorite regression model, etc. With different regularizations, etc. Sort of. So this, what you see here, what performed best is a regression forest approach, where we tried different models as well. And so here we are most interested in the relative strength between the two data sources. So let me try to explain. So here, this is an out of sample R squared. I mean, out of sample in the sense of sort of cross-validated R squared. So sort of you use 90% of the data to predict the other 10. You have predictions for this 10. In the end, you have predictions for all sort of sets of 10, and then you compute the R squared value. So if you use Facebook data alone, then so we do this both in the Philippines and in India. So for all the locations with a ground truth in the Philippines, you get an R squared of sort of close to 0.6. Okay, this is, you'll see how that compares to others in a second. But then it's actually, it goes down if you look at just at urban or just at rural, because these are now harder problems. Because once you look just at urban locations, those are typically richer to begin with, so there's less, variation left to be explained. This is why the R squared goes down, because they are more homogeneous, so it becomes a harder task. Similarly, if you just look at rural areas, they're typically poorer. So again, there's less variation left to begin with, so it becomes a harder task. This is why these two are always lower than the first one. This is Facebook data alone. This is now satellite data alone. So it's somewhat similar, but you'd see that Facebook data performs better in urban areas, and satellite data performs better in rural areas. And then there are different ways of bringing in additional data, such as population density and regional dummies, and then all of these models are improved, but you get the same sort of trend, where again, Facebook has a sort of higher predictive power in the urban areas, satellite is better in rural areas. And then, surprise, surprise, if you combine the two, you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get a model that's better than everything else, both in urban and in rural areas. In India, though, it's a bit of a different story. So both models perform better in terms of absolute R squared, but the satellite model always outperforms the Facebook model. And we believe this is due to lower Facebook penetration, So whereas Philippines is quite advanced in terms of internet penetration, also Facebook penetration, India is still lagging further behind. So in that context, it might not be quite a strong a predictor. I'll skip some of the others. So again, this is now looking at refugees in Syria, a similar kind of thing where we look at the sort of devices they use to access poverty, to access vulnerability. The gender gaps I already hinted at, where we built models that use the gender gap on Facebook to predict the gender gap on the internet in general. And we combine this with offline variables and the combination on online and offline variables performs best. And this is also part of now what's called SDGs Today's portal. There's a website, so we are quite pleased with this. This is sort of part of the, let's say, official SDG monitoring efforts. Yeah, just related to COVID, just very quickly, so we also actively used Facebook ads quite extensively to advertise a screening survey in a lot of different languages, not just in Qatar, but also in Nepal, India, Philippines. I think I'm missing a couple of other countries or so. And in total, I think about 2 million people took our self-screening tool. So this is how we used. In this case, we actively ran the ad. We were not just looking at the planning stage. But this is related to something more broadly where we are interested in what's called precision public health, right? Where we would like to see how this targeted advertising can be used for good, right? Like getting the right message to the right person, right? So here, for example, we are working with Qatar Cancer Society to see if breast cancer screening rates could be improved by getting the right message, right? Maybe some people are more receptive to something that emphasizes the family, versus others are more receptive to something that emphasizes more the individuality, right? And maybe Facebook and other social media platforms have actually something that allows to distinguish these different groups. Closing thoughts. So yeah, so just so what's to like about these platforms? Again, so it's not just Facebook, a lot of other platforms. It's real time. It's anonymous and aggregate, so that's good. So again, I mean, as far as privacy, I don't see a lot of concerns. Again, group level harm is a different thing, but at least privacy, I don't see concerns. A lot of different targeting attributes that are available. Downsides, so we are relying on a black box so like we don't really know how Facebook infers that somebody has lived in Venezuela. We have a lot of clues and hints but ultimately we don't know exactly, right? So this makes it really, really important to validate as much as possible against official data and not just take it as face value because it might just be garbage right? There's certainly bias, so not everybody's on these platforms. Sometimes exactly who's missing is the signal for us. So for example, when we find areas where women are underrepresented, that becomes the signal for us. So in that case, that's actually good. But in other cases, we have to do more work to correct for the bias. But at least we can at least the platform tells us the bias, right? It allows the disaggregation, so we're not just blind to the bias. We can actually learn about the bias. The users patterns change over time, right? So whatever model works now might not work 2 years, 3 years from now, right? Because the platform itself might change and how people interact with it might change, right? There's always a problem. So, this line of research the actual model will probably not be useful 10 years from now, but hopefully, the general insights on how to approach advertising platforms still will be. There's no historic data available. So unfortunately, if you wanted to know what happened due to 4G usage as a response to COVID, I don't think I can answer that. I'll have to double check, but I don't think I can. And there's a risk of misuse again at the at the group level, right? Like for example, being from Germany, it makes me uneasy that I could create a map of locations in Germany where a lot of people are interested in Jewish holidays, right? Like, and if you know anything about German history, that also should make you a bit uneasy. Again, I don't know who these individuals are. And probably I just find the obvious that, big cities have more such people. So then, there's nothing really surprising there. But, maybe there's something surprising there. Maybe for some reason there is a village that has a very large Jewish population. And somehow that maybe is something that I wasn't aware of before or not, right? At least, but this risk exists. Yeah, just if you work in this space, I spend a lot of time just talking to stakeholders and, all these UN agencies, and, they're often there and they're not, sometimes they know a lot about data science, sometimes they don't. So there's a lot of, effort and sweat and time that goes into just, outreach, etc. Right? And also it's really important, if you do reach out so that you don't just assume that technology will be a solution. Right? Often we've also said, thanks for reaching out, but I don't think this type of data or we can really help. Probably just a standard survey is your best solution in this particular case, right? So it's not that this is a magic sort of cure all or sort of so, right? So just be aware of that. So thanks again, and at least hopefully we still have some time for additional questions. And here, otherwise, feel free to shoot me an email or look at references.
Wow, thank you. I must confess, I didn't actually read the abstract or the title. I just knew I wanted to come to the talk, but you've opened my eyes to something I had no idea about. Really interesting. Damiano is very happy. Do we have any questions? You can either use the hand, you can type in on the chat, or you can just open your mic and start speaking. So there's a question on the chat, says, is there an estimation of the ratio of smartphone owners or people that have access to internet in poor areas? Will the lack of connected devices be a strong signal by itself?
Is there an estimation of the ratio of smartphone owners who have access? There might be. So some UN agencies have asked me related questions, also related to sort of desktop users, right? Again, okay. So let's look at sort of just the basic stats that you can get. So mobile access. So in total, I think there are like 2.4 billion Facebook users or something. So out of 2.4 billion, just under 2 billion primarily use mobile devices, right? Sort of. So that's already sort of this. So out of those, how many primarily use 4G? So this would be like 800 million or so Wi-Fi access. Oh, that's also, it's already here. It's about 1 billion, right? Sort of. So a lot of people who have mobile devices still primarily collect on Wi-Fi, which in some locations is actually something good. So if you have access to Wi-Fi, that means there's proper infrastructure in place, etc. Sort of. So it's not necessarily like a bad sign. So short answer is I don't know. So there might be there are things related to the platform you can look at, like, I don't know, Windows 7 or Windows 10. Here sort of. So we see the numbers are much lower, so you can sort of see how many people are still primarily relying on desktop for accessing Facebook. Again, of course, Facebook is not the same as the internet, because maybe people access their Facebook on their phone while they work on their laptop, right? Like sort of. So right, like so short answer is, there might be signals in here, but I certainly don't have like statistics that are ready to be used.
So we've got a couple of comments. People have said fascinating or terrifying, or
that's
terrifying
perfect.
And fascinating.
That's what I go after.
Excellent. Well, perfect. I'll tell my PhD students that's what they have to do. You have to terrify your audience. So I think Ahmed had his hand up just before Flora. So Ahmed.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ingmar, for this interesting talk. It really brings value in terms of makes you really appreciate the kind of research that can help the community. And I got I have two questions. So the first one is related to what you did on Facebook that are using the advertisement platform, which I've never used before. And you said that there was a discrepancy between the official numbers and the ones that you get on Facebook. But at the same time, you don't have the means to prove that the ground truth is not actually representing the real population. Mm-hmm. But then you try to estimate the poverty level using the Facebook data to train your model. Have you tried? So my question is how this makes your model for predicting poverty credible, knowing that they are different from the actual ground truth that exists, that's released by the official organizations? And have you tried, for example, to prove first that the Facebook data is more reasonable by comparing it to several social media data sources as well before building the poverty model?
Right. So for the triangulation with other data sources, we haven't tried that in the poverty project, because the other platforms don't quite have the same resolution So for example, Snapchat or something is, I think, mostly at the city level. In some cases, it's at the sort of neighborhood level, but never smaller than this or So Twitter is typically at the city level, and all the other platforms are more broad. So we wouldn't get the same sort of spatial granularity So this is for other projects. For the gender gaps, we have tried to look at other platforms as well, where it's like more at the national level or sometimes sort of state level. For the poverty stuff, so yeah, I mean, this misalignment with the ground truth is really, I mean, it's most pronounced, I think, for migration data. I think that's even worse than for some of the sort of poverty issues. But even there, so for example, for the poverty project that I showed, the ground truth is from 2016 or 17, I forgot. But our data is from 2019, if not 2020, right? And so now there's also temporal misalignment, right? So if we don't predict the ground truth, right, sometimes we are not sure if is it just maybe our model is perfect. It's just, the ground truth is no longer updated. The only sort of hope I have is that now this year, so there are a number of efforts. I mean, there's the ongoing census round. And so in a couple of locations, we are collecting Facebook data that's sort of temporally aligned, in particular in Nairobi and in Accra, there then, once the census data is processed and, readable to use maybe a year and a half from now, whatever, at least we will, in retrospect, have something that's temporally aligned to rule at least that, mismatch, right? And then at least we'll have something where we get as close as possible to something with sort of perfect ground truth and everything aligned. But yeah, so sorry, there's sort of, it's always, yeah.
That's very informative. But my question was related to, I know that you collaborate closely with the UN. So how do they perceive those models that are trained based on the Facebook data, not the official data sets?
Yeah, so it depends on the use case, right? So there is the when it comes to so even in the migration setting, that's sometimes interesting, right? So in most cases, so the country offices are typically guessed by the host country, right? So as such, they more or less had to sort of, and this is now me speaking, I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody else, right? But they somewhat have to sort of tread the government line, So that also means that if the government puts out a certain number on something, that sort of national office might not be in a position to question that, right? So for example, in the migration case, we've come across those sort of issues, right? Where if country X puts out a certain number, and even if that agency knows that number is not trustworthy, they cannot officially say this number is garbage, just ignore it, because they are sort of guests there, right? So however, they can still use other estimates that might be better for different purposes. So for example, when they talk to donors, they can say, hey, here's what official numbers say, but forget this. The true, dimension of the crisis is like this. It's much bigger, much worse. Here are numbers to sort of back this up, right? And those negotiations and discussions, they're more sort of open to use sort of other numbers. Similarly, apart from the country offices, the regional offices sometimes have more flexibility. So if they report like on the situation in a whole continent, they are more open to sort of contradict individual countries like here and there, because they have a different sort of perspective, right? And so again, in some cases, their hands are quite tight, that they really have to stick to very official, very approved by the local government numbers before they can sort of endorse it, right? So for example, also for the internet access gender gaps, the ground truth that we typically use is reported by the individual countries, right? So for better or worse, that is the country, the data that's the best available data that we train on. etc. Right? And the ITU wouldn't be in a position to now say, what, we don't believe country X. Let's just, publicly shame them, and let's just, put sort of other numbers, in place, right? And so it very much sort of depends, right? But then on the ground, not so much like, in the sort of UN affiliate space where you have sort of like big NGOs or that actually do on the ground interventions. They have more flexibility, right? Right? They can sort of, they know these issues. And also, it's not that the UN doesn't know these issues. It's just that their hands are a bit more tight, right? Because they are close to the local governments. They could, act on this more directly. They can say, oh, great. Okay, you have something subnationally. Okay, that's not maybe validated and endorsed by the official government. I don't care. Let me still use this for planning my intervention. So it's a bit, it depends on like your fin sector itself. It's unlikely that our estimates will be part of the official UN World Statistics on poverty in country X. That's, I think, unlikely, but that they are sort of part of more exploratory, additional data or something or sort of. So that's feasible.
Right. Thank you. I won't ask the next question, so Flora can go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Ahmed. So yeah, Flora.
Thank you for an amazing talk. So I'm just wondering if you have, I mean, there is social connectedness index in Facebook data. I wonder if there is a way to ensure we extract groups, for example, like we know, we want to be able to find people who are socially connected, and therefore we can then extract the aggregates based on this connectedness rather than just individual, aggregates based on individuals.
So Facebook itself, certainly they release. So first, a big shout out to Facebook. They're also quite active in this sort of data for good space themselves. Sort of. So for example, also related to COVID, they would share mobility data with vetted partners. And so if you're interested in sort of accessing data, Facebook, in particular for humanitarian
we have access to that. Yep.
Perfect, right? So the Geo Insights portal and etc.
Yep.
Sort of, right? So is your question more related to the social network structure?
No, my question is to do with the advertising platform, whether you could actually control the sort of data that you get, whether you want to get the aggregation based on groups that are socially connected to, let's say, a certain degree, for example.
So the closest, I don't know if this is okay. So there's one. Okay, so the only thing related to social network we found is, and this is now a bit of a hack, but this some of my collaborators have explored. No, sorry, no, it's a friend. No, wait, where is it? Friends of. Right. So you can get information about people who are close friends of people with certain birthdays coming up, right? And typically, of course, obviously, right, you would. Now, assuming that birthdays are more or less uniformly distributed across the year, that gives you a sort of roundabout way to sort of estimate social network sizes, or to sort of skew your collection towards people with a bigger or social, bigger or smaller social network or sort of. Or so. I mean, I know this is not what you asked, but this is the. Other than this, there's very few things related to social networks that you can get here. I don't know if this is helpful. Sorry, maybe.
Right. No. That's good to know. Oh, just one quick question. So essentially, because this is not historical, so you have to continue to crawl it. Are you able to log and then share it? Like, could we even get some of the data they've logged, for example?
So from Facebook itself, I don't think you. So basically, short answer is best if you start your own sort of data collection.
Okay.
If for something related to migration or something you're interested in data, feel free to also get in touch with me, and we can see what we can, if we can help you out.
Great, thank you.
I've done what I normally do, which is I've taken over, and Barla, you were actually the person who introduced Ingmar. But look, I'll finish. A statistic that I was watching throughout the talk, Ingmar, was how many people came to the talk and how many stayed. And I can tell you that it was basically constant. Barely anybody left, which is an incredible sign and an indication of just a fascinating talk. You took us in a direction I just didn't expect, and I think you've stunned a number of us, but in a fascinating and interesting way. Yeah. I kind of wish that we'd advertise this a bit more widely, actually, because there's a whole bunch of people in RMIT, a whole bunch of people who would have loved this, and maybe we'll be cheeky and ask you to come back sometime. But
sure. Sure.
Truly, thank you so much. That was a fantastic talk.
Yeah, thanks again, and thanks for accommodating my time. I know it's a bit late at your location, but this was more, just more convenient for me. So I appreciate the flexibility.
Not at all, really. Thank you very much. And Barla, a fantastic speaker. You really, really great. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye bye.
Thank you, Ingmar. Bye bye.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Bye.